Hello, welcome to the show. This is Emotional Badass, where Moxie meets Mindful. I'm your host, Nikki Eisenhauer, life coach and psychotherapist. And today we're going to discuss the process of grief for highly sensitive people. Hello, y'all. We are feelers. Remember, it's part of why you tune in and listen. We're highly sensitive people. We are 15 to 20% of the entire population. It means we feel things a little differently. Our nervous systems are very finely attuned. As I talk about grief, what I want for you from this episode is to give you a deeper understanding of your own relationship with grief. And I hope it culminates in giving you a great permission to shepherd yourself through the process of grief and what might be particularly difficult for a highly sensitive person when it comes to grief. Grief work is something I'm very passionate about. It is one of the few things that I can say with full force and certainty, all of us will feel, 100% of us will feel grief, and we will feel it again and again and again. We feel grief about anything that we might lose. For people who observe, who have a lot of emotional attachment to people, to things, to the world, is how we process. Grief is a particular struggle. Originally, when we did Emotional Badass, my intention was for it to be the emotional education that we crave. We might not even know that we crave an emotional education when it comes to grief, but I believe that we do. I hope today serves some of that craving. The stages of grief are common knowledge now, really. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is the person in mental health and the study of grief that gave us these 5 stages. They're typically denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. Now, I'm just going to go over these different stages quickly because I want to talk about grief really other than these stages today. Things to know about these stages of grief are that they're not like stair steps. You don't just walk through them and get done with each one, check them off, and move on to the next one. A grief process is more like being inside of a pinball machine or a ping pong ball match. That little ball of grief, it goes back and forth. We go into and out of these different stages in layers again and again and again. Remember to find Emotional Badass wherever you get your podcasts. If you haven't already, please make sure to hit that subscribe and follow button. It helps support the show and it helps you get more videos like this in your feed and never miss a thing. Denial it's not just like a willful denial. Denial is part of grieving because we can't accept the fullness of what a loss means all in one moment. Just like we can't eat an entire cake by shoving the whole thing in our mouth, we would choke. We would sort of choke on our pain if we were even able to accept the fullness of any loss all in one moment. A lot of people think about denial as this willful dismissal, like, oh, I drink 40 beers a day, I'm not an alcoholic. We tend to think of that as denial, and of course that's denial. But denial is more nuanced than that. All of our feelings have some kind of utility, even if that's hard to figure out in the midst of a painful emotion. Denial helps us bite off what we can chew and digest little parts of what this loss means over time so that we don't get sick on it. Anger, pretty self-explanatory. We get angry. Why do we get angry in grief? Because we are not in control of what we lose very often. Or we made some pretty big mistakes. We're not happy with ourselves within our choices or our actions or our reactions. So we may be angry at ourselves about what we've lost. Depression is often described as anger turned inward. The anger is the fiery part of the grief, the madness we feel at what we can't control. The depression is the internalized sadness, the ache of the loss, the down heaviness of processing the emotions that come with our losses. Bargaining tends to be the stage that I find most sensitive people don't really understand. We don't talk about it as much. It's not in the common vernacular in the way that depression or anger or denial is. Bargaining is when we beg God or the universe or forces beyond our control, beyond our understanding. We bargain. I'll never drink again if you just let me have another moment with this person. Give me another shot at this relationship and I'll never yell. I'll never raise my voice again. Let me hug my loved one or give me another shot at this career. And I'll be on my best behavior. I'll go to church every week. I'll donate food to kids. This is when we beg and bargain with the forces that are beyond us. This is where we're psychologically figuring out our power. We don't have any bargaining chips in this bargain, but our psychology, our emotionality, our attachment to people and to things, to experiences, to ideas, to identities, doesn't really understand that. And just until it does. And that's where we get to acceptance. And ultimately, that's what we're moving towards in a grief process, whether we realize that or not. Not everyone will get to an acceptance point. Some people will get stuck in anger or stuck in depression or stuck in the bargaining of, universe, why won't you just fill in the blank? Acceptance is a whole lot more than just, all right, fine. I accept I can't change what I can't control and I accept what is. Acceptance when it comes to grief is so much more than that. Grief actually changes us. And acceptance is about accepting how we have been changed by the process of grief. When we make purpose, we are accepting that life is different now, and we are using our pain process of grief, hopefully, to grow, to evolve, to learn, to do better, to be able to move through difficult emotion even more swiftly. Grieving as a human being is very natural. It is still a puzzle to me that we go through all of our education without getting classes in things like grief. Know that you are doing well for yourself when you seek out such learning, such growth, because we're always going to lose things. Every time we take a step forward, we lose something. I want you to really consider that I've said the process of grief. Take a moment to center yourself on what process really means. The process of creating a new human. We think of that as taking 9 months, right? But it takes so much longer than that. Because a fertile woman has to go all through her life to get to that fertility moment and then develop the baby. So much process. Growing a tomato from a seed is a process. Learning a language is a process. If you catch a cold or the flu, your body goes through a process of unwellness to get to wellness again. All processes take time. Take a certain amount of patience, a certain amount of understanding, a certain amount of diligence. There's something very immersive about any process. Processes unfold, and they're affected by so many factors. I can't just throw that tomato seed somewhere and expect it to just magically grow because it's a tomato seed. Even though all of the intelligence of that tomato seed is right there contained in that seed. We typically think of sunlight and water as the main factors to grow that tomato, right? But it's also the quality of the soil. its mineral content, its pH, the depth, the level of the soil, how the soil holds or releases moisture, the size and shape of a container if we're growing in a container, the pests, the bugs that may infiltrate the growth of that seed. I happen to have 2 kitties in my house. Right now, I am grieving a plant casualty. A plant I had for many years finally bloomed, and then all of a sudden, one of my 2 cats has decided to go at this plant. I'm still in the anger phase of losing this plant. I'm a little bitter about it. Not really, but kind of, half joking. That plant is a loss. All of these things affect the process of how or even if this seed is to grow into a tomato. What a process. The process of grief is also affected by many, many factors, some of which we can control, some of which we can't. But we get to make choices all along the way about how we're going to contribute to the ways that we move through our own grief. As I've said, I couldn't really control my cat going into that plant, but I could control adding a growth light to it. The more that we accept that we get to affect some of the factors, the more that we can positively make those choices towards the positive outcome that we want. And when it comes to grief, we don't just want acceptance, we want peace. We want ease. We don't want continuous struggle or continuous heartache or continuous regret. Peace. If you would like to experience commercial-free episodes while supporting my small team that produces the show, we would love to have you on our Patreon. The second you sign up on our Patreon, you will get hundreds of hours of exclusive audio and video. You will get episodes that have not been released on this main feed, and you will have access to the live stream Q&As. It's the quickest way to support the show and support your own healing journey. I love the Patreon. It is such a beautiful circle of y'all supporting me while I support you. Something just feels so beautifully right about that. It makes me smile every time I'm talking about it or thinking about it. Because we observe and feel as highly sensitive people, the way other people just sort of wake up and breathe. Because our nervous systems are different. Science is proving this. It already has, and it continues to prove that we have different nervous systems. We observe more. We very well may have more mirror neurons, more of the human stuff that reflects back at us. We take in more sensory information. We're very accepting of this. If someone has better hearing than I do, we very much accept that. We're comfortable with that. If the person standing next to me looking at a beautiful mountain landscape needs glasses to see the mountains in the distance and I don't, well, then we know that my eyesight is stronger, healthier. We might even use the word better than someone else's. But when it comes to our emotional selves, the processes inside of a sensitive person that are harder to study, to quantify, to qualify, to hone in on so that we actually can study it, our energy, vibes between people, nonverbal communication. There's so much that we pick up on, we can't measure it the way that we can so easily measure sight and sound. So we don't have as much comfort in accepting within ourselves or the world accepting that there really are people who have better feely parts, just like someone may have better hearing or better sight than me. Doesn't always feel like a positive to a sensitive person. Takes a lot of energy to process the extra stuff that we pick up from being alive, from moving through life. If we tend to be loyal-hearted people, hard-working people, willing to work hard at not losing someone, then we may grieve harder if we lose someone, if we lose someone to death, if we lose someone to the end of a relationship showing itself. We may grieve harder, carry more weight It may color our life view of today or of a season of our lives. We grieve with an expansiveness. This starts to get into maybe what would typically be shown as some codependency. I don't want you to hear this as something dysfunctional. I think it's a loving part of how we move through the world. I think it's a human way that we move through the world. We won't just grieve for ourselves. We will grieve for the world. And we have to figure out what to do with that as we live through this modern time of the internet, making us aware of so much hardship across the entire planet, so much more than we could ever comprehend before technology has taken off. Now, when I say as sensitive people, we grieve more, I'm not taking away from people who are not highly sensitive. And I want to highlight that this is different than drama for the sake of drama. It's dishonest if someone plays up their grief to try to get out of work or get out of chores or get out of responsibilities. That's manipulative. If we're being honest with ourselves and others about our grief process, our deep, genuine loss is felt in a heavy way. It drags on our energy. It drags on our life force. And highly sensitive people and the average person tends to not know what to do with these feelings, where to put them, how to guide them. One of the big questions that I get, not just in reference to grief, but into all our feelings, is how do I just have feelings? Which has become to me a commentary that society doesn't really deal with having feelings. We tend to sweep things under the rug. We tend to ignore things, numb out. We don't get a lot of direct modeling or education in just sitting and having feelings. Toddlers do this brilliantly. They get upset. Somebody is mean to them, took their toy on the playground, won't let them go down the slide. They're liable to just plop down on the ground and cry and pitch a fit and get all those feelings out. And not a minute too soon, when they're actually done with their feelings, they will wipe their little eyes, take a breath, and they'll be done. And they'll typically run back into play. Our societal continued discomfort with very normal emotion teaches toddlers to start stuffing their emotions, to do what is unnatural instead of what is natural. And so most of us, I'll say all for the sake of this conversation, so all of us grow up sort of backwards in our relationship with feelings, thinking that we're supposed to stuff them. The first thing we tend to hear if we emote, if we cry, is, "Oh no, please don't cry," even by sensitive people, deep people, people willing to even have feelings. What a huge normalization in our society that we start to cry and people go, "No, don't cry." So I implore you to work with that subconscious belief system that almost all of us have picked up. Work to teach yourself, hey, I can sit with my feelings. It's right to. And I'm not going to make it overcomplicated. I knew how to do this as a toddler. I can do this now. So what do we grieve? Absolutely anything we lose, y'all. When we say yes to something, the truth is we're often saying no to something else. We may feel a slight little quick pang of grief to a deep grief process that's begging us, asking us to move through a process to be able to release what's heavy. To the average person, they sort of grieve mostly the biggies. Somebody's death, the job we wanted but didn't get. If someone has an accident and they sever their spine and they can't walk, we grieve the ability to walk. Miscarriage, it's a sort of societally sanctioned, allowable grief, as is divorce. I could say youth. There's a whole industry that scares women about aging. And we never hear from that industry what's awesome about aging, what we gain when we're aging. Wisdom, maybe a better relationship with our finances, more understanding of ourselves and others. So much that we might gain. It's not part of the public conversation, is it? As I sit down to record this, a few days ago, Hurricane Helene hit the U.S. from Florida all the way up the coast. Florida, Tennessee, North Carolina hit very hard. There are hundreds of people that are still missing, maybe even more into the thousands, depending on where you're getting numbers from. So much loss, so much invitation to meet ourselves in the process of grieving so that we don't unnecessarily carry weight that we don't need to. If we just carry the weight of grief, we are surviving life. We are not thriving. We are not living. We are not being present in the moment. There can almost be a secret sort of dark relationship with grief, like it's a bad friend that we know is bad for us, maybe like a drug dealer. And we don't let the other parts of our life maybe meet up with that drug dealer. We want to keep our relationship with grief in the light, not some kind of dark private secret just because people say, oh, please don't cry. I was 25. I'm a New Orleans native when Hurricane Katrina hit. I'm now 44 years old. A lot of time and space has come between me and what I lost in Katrina. I had survivor's guilt because I happened to live in the French Quarter when Katrina hit. That was the only area that didn't flood. So everyone I ran into when I went back home that year, oh, what did you lose? How bad was the water? And I had to be the one saying, I didn't. I was in the French Quarter. I had lost everything I had owned the year before when I escaped in a very abusive relationship. So when Katrina came through, even if I would have lost everything, I didn't have that much. I had a lot of complex feelings tied to that kind of grief, tied to those moments of having to say aloud to someone who had lost everything, my place didn't flood. We have a survivor's guilt because we are biologically wired to be tribal. Let's say I was talking to someone who lost all of their clothing and they only had one outfit, and I had a bunch of clothing and they were my size. That survivor's guilt may prompt me to give a shirt to someone in the tribe. We don't just feel a survivor's guilt to feel terrible, to feel awful, to feel guilty. Like I've said earlier in this episode and so many others, there is utility to all of our emotion, even if that's hard to understand in the moment of feeling it. I still to this day miss the trees. The very old, centuries old, giant live oaks that line the streets of my grandparents' house. They died when I was a teenager and I used to drive to their street and sometimes get out of my car and park and just touch those trees. It's not just that I grieve the trees lost. Looks like a wasteland to me now, with brand new homes where there used to be historic ones and very few trees, certainly not those old oaks. It's not just the trees that I grieve. I grieve that I touched those trees as a little girl, and my grandparents did too. It's my connection to them that those trees represent. And in the loss of them, what I had were those trees. And then I lost those too. It's okay to allow a sadness. Some things that we grieve will completely grieve and we'll never feel sad about them again. They'll be done, they'll be over. And others may touch us the way the idea of the trees is touching me now, all the days of our life. We need to understand that that has to be okay. It's the way our grief works. It's the way our connection system works. When I feel that little pain, it also connects me to what was beautiful about those memories with the trees. Just like any day has the darkness and the light, the day and the night, our emotions have a darkness and a lightness too, and they need each other. There's an interplay there that is very natural that we don't need to fight. So HSPs feel what is lost beyond these societally agreed upon acceptable griefs. Our differences as highly sensitive people show up in part in what we grieve and then in how deeply we grieve. This is an incomplete list of common HSP griefs that I've worked on within myself and with other HSPs across the span of my career. We may grieve our educations, that was a season. It's a time that's over. This is a big part of the adult loneliness that I hear my clients talk about so often. Education forced us to be around people, to make connections. When we are out of that season of our lives, we lose that forced getting together. It's not just the piece of learning, it's the piece of connecting through learning. And when we move forward, when we graduate, when we move on, that's lost. We tend to grieve time lost. We can be angry in that grief process of the time lost to stop and do taxes, as an example. A lot of HSPs are angry with themselves and life because they're grieving the time that they believe they've lost in processing as a highly sensitive person. It can very easily seem like other people just have an easier time because they don't have to process all this sensory information or emotion. And while there may be truth to that, we don't want to get stuck in anger. We don't want to get depressed with this thought. We grieve opportunities lost. We grieve innocence lost. We may grieve a moment in space and time that can never be recreated. We may feel a deep longing for earlier moments or memories in our life that culminates in a big grief. I witness highly sensitive people grieving a lot of what I would call befores. Sensitive people will grieve, they will regret what they didn't know before, what they know now that they couldn't have known before, and what was lost because of whatever they were ignorant to. I didn't know how to properly take care of myself as a young woman. I put myself in situations that were not always healthy for me, safe, reasonable. And I was numbing out a lot of my grief of what I had lost in my childhood by drinking way too much, and it got me arrested. It's a lot of grief wrapped up in what can seem like just a moment, just an experience. Sensitive people grieve potential in themselves and others that will just go unmet in this lifetime. They grieve the possibility of what could be, the roads and paths not taken. We can even grieve what we've lost due to perfectionism. When I look back at my education, I've got 2 degrees. I made it harder on myself because of perfectionism. I enjoyed it less. I stressed myself out because of perfectionism, and it robbed me of joy. It robbed me of ease that I didn't just deserve. Wow, did I need? I just didn't know how to give it to myself. Perfectionism has taken a lot from me in my life. I don't want to keep allowing that sneaky old perfectionism to take my joy. Realizing that grief, working through it in the ways that I've been able to, helps me honor myself by not letting perfectionism take over. I don't always do it perfectly, but I do hold this as a constant intention. We can even grieve codependency. And that's shocking. You might sit with me and go, but Nikki, Codependency wears me out. It makes me a people pleaser. It makes me yes everybody else and not myself. Why would I grieve that? We developed codependency to try to survive, to get smiles from people, to get atta-girls, atta-boys, to get positive attention, to have people light up for ourselves. There's a real simplicity to a child figuring out subconsciously, I will just be perfect and I will perfectly show up for other people, and that's how people will never be mad at me, and that's how they will never leave me. We may grieve the simplicity of that when we just didn't even know any better. We grieve the energy that other people would give us when we were codependently showing up for them. They don't give the same energy when you set a boundary, when you don't overextend yourself. When you say, I'm sorry, I'm going to pass on that. I don't have the energy for that in my week. Maybe next time. We grieve sometimes with an added layer of unnecessary shame and embarrassment. Sometimes abuse survivors will even grieve the abusers we've left behind. There's no real space for that in society, within ourselves, or with each other. It's not talked about enough. It's not normalized enough. If you've been following my show, my story for years, then you know this about me already. I put my abusive dad in prison. He abused me. He did to me one of the worst things you can do to children. Inexcusable. But he was also the most involved parent I had. He lit up for me when I walked into a room. He encouraged me academically and in anything that interested me, in ways my mother and my absentee biological father didn't. He was warm with me. I watch survivors struggle with the complexity of this. They feel embarrassed. They feel shameful. They yearn for the good parts of their abuser sometimes. So I want to say this with a bunch of clarity for anyone who has had this experience in their past or maybe going through this right now. I want to be very clear. You do not need to torture yourself with the complexity of this type of grief. You don't have to spin yourself in circles or be confused. Multiple things can be true at once. And I share my story so that you can have a real life example in your world. I am in deep peace and acceptance from moving through my grief process. That, number one, my abuser is not and will never be allowed into my adult life. And number two, he absolutely lit up for me like a dad is supposed to. And it's okay that I enjoyed that. It's okay that I sometimes miss that. In the acknowledgement of me missing that, I can let go of another little piece of that grief. And for this type of abuse, I may be releasing the grief of it all the days of my life. In grieving familial abusers, we learn that we can't just have the good parts without the bad. Our inner children struggle with that. That's why we tap in our wise woman and our wise man to hold space for our inner child. When the bad is intolerable and even criminal, we are allowed and even encouraged to set strong, clear boundaries for our safety, our sanity, our security, and our self-respect. We can even set no contact boundaries, and we can still have all of these feelings. Sometimes other people who love us and support us and want what's best for us are very scared by the complexity of these emotions. They feel more comfortable if we hate our abuser and we stay angry, because that's an assurance emotionally that we won't let someone back in. We won't let them close. We won't let them hurt us again as adults. And if we purely hate and reject all things in relation to an abuser, there's a clarity there that humans like. We struggle with the complexity of these truths. It just has to be. that a survivor allows an honest appraisal of how you feel without self-judgment? Because that self-judgment just clouds the truth. You get to give yourself permission to sit with the complexity, the sometimes totally opposite feelings of someone able to show up and show part of themselves as a very safe person and then another part as very dangerous. Sometimes self-respect may look like allowing ourselves these complexities. All right, y'all, this episode has gotten really, really long, so we are going to split it into a part 1 and a part 2. I'm going to stop right here. Look for part 2 coming soon. If you would like to experience commercial-free episodes while supporting my small team that produces the show, we would love to have you on our Patreon. The second you sign up on our Patreon, you will get hundreds of hours of exclusive audio and video. You will get episodes that have not been released on this main feed, and you will have access to the live stream Q&As. Visit patreon.com, Emotional Badass, to get monthly bonus episodes and video live streams, exclusive discounts, and access to our community of badasses. It's the quickest way to support the show and support your own healing journey. I love the Patreon. It is such a beautiful circle of y'all supporting me while I support you. Something just feels so beautifully right about that. It makes me smile every time I'm talking about it or thinking about it. I am an emotional badass. You are an emotional badass. And together we are where Moxie meets mindful. Light and love, and I'll see you right here next time for a brand new episode. And I'll see the rest of you on Patreon. Till next time, take care. Light and love. Bye-bye.